Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Professor March, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, you're here in Sarajevo promoting your latest book on Muslim democracy, co-authored with Racheda Ghannouchija, which is essentially a collection of essays, right, and thoughts on the ideas of Racheda Ghannouchija. But he himself has written numerous articles and given many interviews on where he shared his thoughts on what he believes is an ideal Islamic state. So was this book sort of a summary of all his thoughts thus far, or has he changed his views over the years, so you thought it necessary to look into it once again?
Hi, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Hvala vam lijepo na pozivu. Baš mi je drago biti ovdje u Sarajevu. So the book started about maybe 10 years ago because I was writing a book myself on modern Islamic conceptions of sovereignty. And Ghannouchija's very famous book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, or Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi Dawla al-Islamiyya, was a major statement of late 20th century Islamist conceptions of sovereignty, democracy, public freedoms, those sorts of things. And I was working closely with that book in my own research. At the same time, I was editing a translation series out of Yale University Press, and I wanted very much to translate this book for an English audience. I think it's one of the most important books in 20th century Arab Islamic thought. So gradually I came to be acquainted with Sheikh Ghannouchija and his family, and we worked in this translation. And I visited Tunisia a number of times, and then we got the idea of publishing another book, a collection of essays, as well as a dialogue between him and me, a kind of philosophical, theological dialogue on issues of democracy, sovereignty, pluralism, those sorts of things. But the crucial twist, or the crucial importance of the book, is that, as is well known, after the Arab Spring and after the transition to democracy in Tunisia, Ghannouchija's party, Ennahda, formally declared that they were no longer regarding themselves as part of political Islam or Islamism, and adopted the label Muslim democracy. So the big theme of the book is, what is the idea of Muslim democracy as an ideology or as a theory of politics, and how is it different from older conceptions of political Islam and Ghannouchija's own ideas in his earlier book?
What exactly led Ghannouchija to revise his ideas on the concept of an ideal Islamic state?
So that's a very good question. The first thing I would say is that I don't really think there's a clean break. I think if you read Ghannouchija's speeches and statements in the 1980s in Tunisia, in the 1990s when he was mostly in the United Kingdom, you find a lot of the same ideas. You find the idea, first of all, that while Muslims may have an ideal of an Islamic state or governance by the Islamic Sharia, that there are other things that take priority. So in a dictatorship, in a tyrannical regime, establishing freedom comes first. So first, the priority of political and civil freedoms for everybody, that getting rid of dictatorship, getting rid of tyranny, getting rid of torture, getting rid of arbitrary imprisonment, all of these come first. Second, that all political forces in a country like Tunisia that are committed to democracy, even if they're secular or even communist, that they are perhaps partners and fellow travelers in the path towards democracy. So I don't think there was a clean break. However, it's obvious that the experience of the revolution and the experience of forming a new constitution is extremely important. And the obvious factor is, one, that Ghannouchija's party, Ennahda, was never the majority party. They never had more than 40%, usually less. So of necessity, they had to work with other political parties. Right. Second, I think there was an important factor of trying to convey to other parties domestically and internationally that Ennahda was a trustworthy actor, that they're not trying to use power to attain a goal that only pertains to them, that they're sincerely committed to democracy, And so this idea of labeling themselves as Muslim Democrats was a way of signaling that they're sincere in their commitment to democracy and are not just waiting for an opportunity to bring about an Islamic state.
Now, in such an imagined Muslim democracy, according to Ghannouchi, what should the Quran be a source of legislation, the only source of legislation, or just an inspiration for enacting laws?
So I distinguish between two concepts. One is an Islamic democracy, and the second is Muslim democracy. In Ghannouchi's earlier work in Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, I argue that he theorizes a kind of Islamic democracy, which is in the first place characterized by the fact that the majority of the population is not only Muslim, but is morally and emotionally committed Muslims. So they want Islam in the public sphere. They want to be governed by Islam. But in a Muslim democracy, you have many different political parties and actors, and many different demographic groups in the population. Not all of them are religious or are Muslim, or even if they're religiously Muslim, they're not necessarily committed to bringing about religion in the public sphere. So there, according to Ghannouchi, the first objective is whatever democratic system the majority of political actors will accept. So there's a strong emphasis on consensus. There's a strong emphasis on the widest possible consensus, not just a bare minimum, but getting the widest possible agreement for a democratic political system. Now, that political system then has to make laws. It has to make legislation over ordinary matters. Now there, it could be possible that political actors argue for certain legislation on the basis of religious values or religious commitment, and may argue on the basis of the Quran or other sources of religious authority. But the point is that religious authority doesn't have absolute authority above the democratic process.
Now, how do the concepts of islah and maslaha, or public good, public welfare, in his thought inform his understanding of the compatibility between Islamic jurisprudence and democratic governance?
So maslaha, or the public good or the public interest, was always a central part of his thought. And of course, the question with maslaha is how you define it. What exactly is in the public interest? And so with maslaha, whether it's in jurisprudence or whether it's in politics, you always have questions of judgment. Somebody is deciding what right now is the most urgent public interest, what's the most urgent thing to be attained. And so for Ghannouchi, during a transition period, securing democracy and fighting dictatorship is always the most urgent thing. So that takes priority. But then you have the normal range of things: economic well-being, economic development, public order, public welfare, public health, all of these things. And of course, the crucial point about maslaha is that very often it's something that can be agreed upon with non-Muslims. These are goods that are public and social that many people can agree upon as goods.
Now, I was wondering if he touches upon Muslims living in non-Muslim states or in the non-Muslim domain outside of the wider Muslim world, such as Muslims living in the Balkans. And in that case, in the absence of an Islamic government, who has the authority to implement, and what happens to Islamic law in the first place?
Well, again, we're talking about two different conceptions. We're talking about a conception of an Islamic democracy where you have the vast majority of the people being Muslim and wanting some kind of place for religious law. In a Muslim democracy, it's assumed that there is a plurality of political forces, and you can't assume agreement on Islam or Islamic law as the foundation or underpinning of the entire political system. So, a good example, for example, is something like protection of religious symbols or religious sensibilities from speech. So laws against harming religious sensibilities or the sacred. That was something that Ghannouchi's party defended during the democratic period, but they didn't expect that it was something that was already imposed by the political system, by religious authorities, or by the Constitution. They thought it would be something that had to be passed through ordinary democratic legislation. So like anything, you would have to argue for it or negotiate for it or bargain for it, as opposed to the idea that religious law precedes the political system and is already applied and enforced, and then leaves a separate space over for political legislation.
When you look at Ghannouchi's understanding of democracy, when you compare him to Taha Jabir al-Alwani, to Khalid Abu Fadl, and to Ahmed al-Turabi, the Sudanese thinker, are they on the same page?
So those are all very different thinkers. Yeah. And I would say that Ghannouchi's earlier thought in public freedoms in the Islamic State was very similar to that of Turabi. That there was an idea that there's a community that is a believing community, sometimes referred to as Ummah Mu'mina, and that is the demos, that is the democratic community. Whereas in a system in which you're actually trying to build up a democratic system from scratch, the important thing to recognize is there aren't many people that have been responsible for that. So Ghannouchi is a very significant figure because he's not only a political thinker or theorist or jurist, but somebody that had political responsibility during the transition period for negotiating with rivals, defending a constitution, negotiating with his own political party. So there are very few people that were both internationally renowned Islamic thinkers, but also politicians responsible for the transition to democracy. So I don't think that there are a lot of comparisons.
Can the road to democracy in Muslim-majority countries, with all its twists and turns, avoid passing through the gates of religious politics?
You know, it always depends on the balance of forces. So, you know, we sometimes talk about democracy as being a function of people's democratic commitment. Do people really believe in democracy? Are they really committed to democracy? Now, ultimately, I think that is important. So, for example, we see the coup in Tunisia that got rid of democracy. Well, that's because lots of people, beginning with the president, were not committed to democracy, didn't really believe in it. So democratic commitment is very important. But what's equally important is the balance of forces. If you are in a political system in which you don't have an overwhelming majority, you can't get what you want on the basis of your demographic force, you have to work with rivals. And if you decide that, creating a political system, preserving compromise, even when it's difficult and even when it's sometimes unfortunate, is superior than the alternatives, that's what creates democracy more than a sort of moral commitment to democracy against getting what you want.
And when we talk about secularism, would you say that Muslim unease with secularism today is partially rooted in the different legacies of modernization and colonialism that Muslim societies have experienced in the 20th century?
I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of the fact that the idea of secularism in a principled sense, that religion doesn't belong in the public sphere, that's an alien concept, not only to Muslims, but to many Christians. Right. So that has to come from some sort of ideological place. But yes, of course, it's undeniable that the experience of most Muslim countries with secularism is not with a liberal kind of secularism or a kind of secularism that allows for freedom of religion and freedom of public expression of religion. It's either in a kind of authoritarian style like in Turkey or former Yugoslavia, or brutal forms of secularism like in Syria or Iraq or other countries like that.
Why is it the case? Why was secularism in the Middle East, in Arab countries primarily, always associated with and intertwined with authoritarian rule?
Well, first of all, everything was associated with authoritarian rule. The education system, the legal system, organization of professions, agriculture. So everything was authoritarian. And so, of course, the control of religion had to be authoritarian because everything is, and because religion is potentially the most powerful source of alternative moral and political authority.
Right. You know, there's this Syrian writer, Rana Kabani, and she used the term internal colonialism to describe this authoritarian rule of post-colonial elites in the Arab world. So after the departure of European colonialists, Arab countries continued living in very similar conditions, but this time under their own leaders. So there was never really an opportunity for a pluralistic political thought to be developed in the Arab world, is it?
There were small moments of opportunities, like in the 1920s in Syria, but correct. I mean, in most countries, the transition from colonialism to post-colonialism was done in some process of violent decolonization or a transition and a handover from the colonial powers, but there was never a moment, really, until 2011 for an open, pluralistic, democratic refounding or reconstituting moment.
Was it, in this case, Islamist parties or Islam-related, affiliated parties that were mostly in opposition and quite often banned, that spearheaded all these democratic initiatives throughout the Arab world?
Yes and no. So as is well known, the early revolutions in Syria and Egypt and Tunisia at the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011
were mostly secular, yeah.
Well, I don't know if they were secular or not, but they were not organized by the Brotherhood or other Islamist forces. They were youth movements. They were organized in reaction to various forms of oppression and frustration. But of course, it's true that many Islamist groups were, by definition, in opposition to secular dictatorships, and also had as part of their political program a call for democracy. And you can read that in a variety of ways. Either they are genuinely committed to democracy, or they believe that calling for a democracy is a safe way to demand reform from regimes like Egypt or Tunisia. Or it's also perhaps because they believe that in a free and open political process, the vast majority of people will choose Islam, that the masses are religious by nature, and that only a kind of secular elite would choose secularism.
So what exactly, when you look back at the Arab Spring today, what exactly went wrong? I mean, why were Gulf monarchies so intent on supporting counter-revolutionary movements throughout the Middle East to put an end to any grassroots level democratic movements?
Well, you know, the argument is that Gulf monarchies themselves are afraid of creating any alternative model. So if the people can come to power through their own initiative, through their own popular power, and overthrow dictatorships, and then themselves put into place a regime that is democratic but not secular, that has all of the benefits of seeming both authentic and religious and democratic, that this will be a model and an inspiration for all other regimes. So this has to be stopped at all costs. That's one view. I don't know if that is exactly how various sorts of Gulf rulers think. There's also a sense that different Gulf powers have different proxies and different allies, and they are very uninterested in losing that authority and losing those relationships. But it's very, very frustrating. And it's hard for me, for example, to see how letting Tunisia continue to struggle to create a democracy was a threat to anybody. It wasn't a threat to France. It wasn't a threat to the Emirates. It wasn't a threat to Saudi. It wasn't a threat to the United States. So why there was a need to interfere in this country and to put the thumb on the scale of counter-revolution remains for me something very, very tragic, and it makes me extremely worried for Syria. So Syria, of course, has now militarily gotten rid of a dictator, and as we all know, many of the forces in Syria are Islamist, some of them with origins in radical jihadi groups, which is certainly cause for concern. But my greatest concern is that outside powers, Israel, which is of course now bombing Syria, occupying land, but other Gulf monarchies perhaps, will do everything in their power to prevent Syria from succeeding and becoming a stable, democratic state with some sort of Islamic component.
For the Western audience, one of the most bewildering and perhaps alarming developments, early developments of the Arab Spring was the rise to power of Islam based parties. Why is there and why is why is there still so much suspicion when it comes to these parties, which are essentially akin to Christian Democrats in Europe?
Well, that's a big answer to your earlier question about why Ghannouchi's party adopted the label of Muslim democracy. They were trying to signal, both domestically and internationally, don't think of us like, previous Islamist movements, especially those that used violence. Think of us more like Christian democratic parties. And in some cases, I think that worked.
In the West, is it changing in the US, for example?
Yeah, I think in Washington, Ghannouchi was well received. He gave lecture tours. And I think in Washington, there was the sense that Ennahda was a democratic party. They were moderate. They were not a threat. And I don't think that the United States was particularly worried about that in Tunisia. France, I think, was a different story. I think France, because of their traditional ideology of secularism, had a hard time imagining that any religious or Islamist party would be something they could work with. But it's a big irony, because when democratic experiments that include Islamist parties in the government are replaced by dictatorships, they're not replaced by liberal secular regimes. So rulers like Sisi or Qais Said, they still draw on religion, and they still use religious forms of argument, and they still try to defend certain aspects of traditional religious morality. So it's not like, in many cases, they're still very socially conservative. So it's not as though the choice is between democracy with Islamists participating and some kind of pure Swedish liberal democracy. So it's always been very perplexing to me why there's an antipathy to that extent to democratic experiments. You could say that there's concern about foreign policy. There's going to be a shift in the way that these governments view the rest of the region, which is possible, but it's not something that can't be managed and dealt with through normal forms of politics that are always being used. Qatar, which is often seen as one of the main supporters on Islamist movements and Islamist democratic experiments, is a very close ally of the United States. One of the U.S.'s biggest bases is in Qatar. So the idea, that Islamist regimes in power are necessarily going to be not something that, different powers around the world can work with does not strike me as plausible. Not every regime is going to become like Iran or something like that.
But you know what's interesting, when you look at the Muslim world from Morocco to Tunisia and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Iraq, the Islamic scholars, the ulama, has been always utilized by these governments to give them legitimacy. So they have provided legitimacy to monarchies, to dictatorships, to military juntas, and to democratic movements. Why hasn't the ulama ever been independent in its thinking? Are they financially dependent on the state that they live in?
Well, of course, there have been independent ulama. There have been people that have come out of traditional madrasas and forms of learning and either been independent from the state or been part of the Islamist movement.
But quite a lot of them living in the West, actually.
Yes. But of course, in these countries, beginning with colonialism in some cases, or beginning with state modernization in other cases, like in the Ottoman Empire and under Muhammad Ali and his successors in Egypt.
Yeah, the Tanzimat movement.
The state brought religious authorities under control. They became state officials. They drew a state salary. They were regulated by the state. And so for political economic reasons, the official ulama are in many ways dependent on state regulation, state control, state salaries. Obviously, in some more authoritarian countries like Egypt through much of the 20th century, there was a fear of persecution, there was a fear of being put in jail. There's also perhaps a sense of we don't have it so bad. We have control over some areas, we have influence over some areas, and we would rather have this influence than have another source of religious authority coming from either Islamist groups or popular movements or popular religious scholars challenging us for authority.
Right, Professor March, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?